Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. Welcome to this fireside chat with the InterBase Experts. Our panel today consists of some of the amazing minds that make up the InterBase product team. We have Marco, if you want to go ahead and start introducing yourself.
Sure. I'm Mark. Ooh, wait, my phone is ringing at the wrong time.
You can tell we're live, that's for sure.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry for that. I'm Marco Cantu. I'm also the Delphi product manager. Well, and one of the Raw Studio product managers. I've been following InterBase throughout the years. I've been using the product myself. I do have a couple of projects online that use InterBase, although I'm not using it to the extent of its power. Yeah, I mean, because I'm also following a lot the database side of Delphi and the integration with databases. This is an area where I'm following over time, and yep, that's me. And I need to silence my phone.
Sriram?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Sriram Balasubramanian, and I'm the InterBase team lead on the engineering side. I've been working with InterBase for a good couple of decades plus, and focus on performance as well as multi-platform compatibility, and also bringing in SQL features as necessary once in a while, but mostly on the performance aspect as well as the cross-platform enablements of InterBase and the various editions and such. So that's where my focus area has been. And so customers can continue to realize whatever the deployment size might be or whatever the deployment platform might be, InterBase is a good solution for you. Happy to be here.
And Stephen?
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, Stephen Ball. I've been using InterBase for since the end of the 90s. Originally, I started developing an application in Delphi, or working with a product in Delphi that used InterBase for managing health clubs, and we were using that with some of the huge chains around the world, including Hilton and Virgin and Fitness First and some of the big health club chains, and expanded that out into golf and to kids play centers and a whole load of different places, which was really important to have a database we could just put down there and leave it there without having to worry too much. So big OEM background with it. And then after I joined Embarcadero, I had about 4 years, I think it was, working as the product manager alongside my pre-sales duties, which is when we kind of did some really kind of cool stuff with change views and things like that. So yeah, nice bit of background.
Thank you. And I'm Mary Kelly. I am a solutions consultant here at Embarcadero. I actually learned about databases from InterBase. It was the first database that I ever had the opportunity to learn and study. So it's been an honor to be able to be a part of the team and to be able to show people really what makes InterBase one of the best databases out there, in my opinion. So for our agenda today, we're going to cover a few topics. We're also going to look at our future roadmap. And then we'll have a portion dedicated specifically to Q&A. So if you have any questions whatsoever during this webinar, please be sure to place them in the questions panel in GoToWebinar, and we'll be able to answer them for you. Starting off with change views. Sriram, Marco, Stephen, would you guys like to kick us off with some comments on change views?
Great,
yeah,
Stephen.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think change views is just one of those really kind of, when we start talking to people about it, it's a real wow moment for them when they're kind of looking at InterBase. And it really kind of spawned out of a lot of conversations we're having just before XE7 was released with customers, with OEMs specifically. Part of being in the OEM program, you get direct access into the product management team through kind of sessions that we kind of put together every now and then to help put into the product, what you need for the future and to help improve the product. And there was a lot of requests around change tracking and replication. And we actually kind of looked at the kind of the industry trends that are going on at the time, and this whole thing around IoT was a big thing that was kind of lurking on the landscape. And we were able to kind of look. I've done an awful lot of work in the past with data replication on a few different database engines, including InterBase. And one of the big challenges around data change tracking was that it's really easy to do on kind of 1 or 2 databases, but when you start scaling it out, it becomes an absolute administrative nightmare. And this is down to the way that databases have to track changes that have been happened to allow them to be replicated. And we just kind of said, we need to make this simple. We need to make it rad, in essence. We need to make this a way that you can put, do your development and then worry about the change tracking afterwards. We need to make this in a way that is not overly a burden on the database design. It's not something you need to think about ahead of time. And that's when we kind of started looking, and we spent, I think it was about 3 or 4 days, wasn't it, Shriram, locked away in a room with the whiteboards out and going, yeah, no, that doesn't work, going back to the beginning of it again and working through. And we came up with this concept of change views, which basically is a subscription-based model, which allows you to subscribe to a subscription. So you can define the subscription, and then any user can subscribe to that to get notice of the change of the data. And what it does is it uses the ACID compliance within the database in a really ingenious way that means that InterBase knows what's happening around you at the time that you're doing stuff. And it also knows...
If I can just interject and just add another comment out there. As many of you are aware, InterBase is a multi-generational architecture. We store different versions of the record based on who the client is and how simultaneous transactions are performing. And this alludes to the point that Stephen mentioned about ACID compliance. Right? The transactionality of your records and how your applications view it is something that InterBase and other databases also provide through MVCC. Right? It's also known as, more popularly known as MVCC out there. But we are also looking at how do we leverage that versioning ecosystem that we have within the database and provide snapshots of those records to subscribers as well. So please continue, Stephen. We wanted to leverage.
It's a really important point though, because that generational view is what allows you to connect to the database and run a set of financial reports against multiple different queries and tables whilst other things are happening and still be looking at the same snapshot. So make sure all the reports line up, because that's the point in time that you're connecting in. That's one of the great things about having these different transactional states and being able to kind of use that and understand what's happening around the user and almost take this kind of fingerprint of your connection to know what's written and committed to the database at the point that you connect in and your transaction starts. And because of that, we're then able to know that what's happening, what's changed before you, and what is being changed but hasn't been committed yet. So that's really important, because sequencing can be an absolute nightmare. An example of that would be, say, I connect to the database and I start changing 100,000 records. And in the meantime, Shriram connects in to update one record and to find out what's changed. Now, I'm still in the middle of doing my commit, so those changes aren't physically in the database yet because they could still be rolled back. But my connection started before him. So in terms of a sequence in time, this is one of the big challenges you get with timestamp organizing of changes in a database. It becomes really, really hit and miss if you've got long-running transactions versus short-running ones, to be able to actually limit down to just what's changed. And with some of the smarts around that and a few other kind of little bits that are added in, we're able to get the ability to reconnect to the database at any point in time without having to have a continuous constant handle, which other database engines allow you to kind of get some feedback of notice of changes on. and to know at a field level specifically which fields have changed, which is fantastic. So in terms of being able to provide a Delta data packet, the way change views works, you connect up, and you start your subscription. So I'm interested in this subscription. You run your SQL statement, and it will then give you the changes from the previous time you ran your subscription. So this is fantastic, because now you can have a briefcased data model that allows you to connect up, run the same query to fetch the data back, and it could be 10 days later and you'll get exactly what has changed. Whereas you could connect 5 minutes later and get exactly what has changed between those 2 points in time without having to keep a long lived handle. So it means if you cached kind of 1,000 records on your iOS device, you can reconnect and find out that there's only been 2 records changed, rather than have to download 100,000 records again, because you need to make sure you've got the latest stock information before you go into a meeting with a huge customer. So that is phenomenally powerful. And then when you start looking at the way it's been implemented, I think the one thing that was almost kind of, it still makes me kind of go wow every time I even think about it, is that there's no logs. There are 0 logs. There's no log files to manage or to deal with. And what this means is, by design, it's really secure, because you don't have, let's use the medical industry, which InterBase is huge in medical. There's so many customers using it within the medical arena. And if you've got a customer patient, if you've got patient data, and the only reason for a specific field to change might be because they've turned HIV positive, for example, that's something you don't want to have in a log file that other people are having to pass as well. Even just by representation that field has changed, you know what's happened. So, if that's restricted data, by having it all integrated into the user security, so subscriptions are managed by user security roles or users, which means only certain people can subscribe to fetch changes of data, and there's no log files to pass. So it's highly secure in terms of tracking and managing and pushing and distributing data changes around as well. And regardless if you've got 1 or like 100,000 or even 1 million devices that are connecting in to track that data change per subscription, the footprint on the database is the same, because there's no log files. Whereas traditional replication technologies, you'd have to have a log for every single destination that it needs to go to. So if you had 20 destinations to push the data to, every single change on a table that needed to log changes would be 21 edits to the database, because you've got the 1 change plus the 20 log records that need to be credited, and you get none of that overhead with InterBase, which is amazing. So yeah, we've seen some really remarkable use cases where people are using change views as an engine alongside existing installations of things like SQL Server, where they're using a program to just simply scan against specific queries and tables to then bulk update an InterBase database locally, and then using the InterBase database to allow the remote connections in to track and distribute the deltas out to all the remote sites. And there's a really interesting use case in the white paper that we've got a link for later on, with a whole pharmacy chain where they used to have to distribute out via CD the entire database of all the drug information. And now they're able to keep that all up to date via change views. So there's been a huge business cost removed from the business by having a single server with InterBase at the head office, which has been phenomenal. And also it meant that the drug information could stay up to date almost by the minute, rather than it could have been weeks out of date in the past, which when you're talking about drug information, that can be quite a major thing, especially if there's kind of critical legislative changes or pushes that are being made around the data. So
yeah, we wanted to actually minimize from a performance aspect, not only in terms of the scalability of how many subscribers can subscribe to the change data. We didn't want to have a linear growth in terms, or exponential growth as well, in terms of the performance part. So not only on the database footprint, it's not really increased. I mean, it's just maintaining the change view information based on the versioning architecture, but also in terms of having a subscription life cycle of that record. As subscribers move on and get the updates or get the changed information, we have information about how many people are subscribing to this table. And as they have moved on, we can actually go ahead and garbage collect, if I can say it. We can take off the obsolete record versions, change stuff that we don't really need to maintain anymore. So it's a self-tuning model in terms of how the data evolves and how much of the backlog has to be kept and how much can be taken out. It's all based on the real garbage collection that happens within the InterBase versioning architecture. So you don't have to have any additional work to be done in terms of cleaning up log files with data that is not required anymore, or you may not even know who is actually subscribed to that information, right? And InterBase maintains all of that just based on who is connected, who is subscribed, when they have fetched the information, and is it relevant to be kept in the database anymore. So that is one aspect of the database, the data lifecycle itself. The other aspect is about we wanted to really find out, as Steven mentioned, about IoT, different devices, different clients from different devices connecting to centralized servers. And network bandwidth is a real big issue, depending upon if you're within your Office Enterprise network, you have much higher speeds. But if you're connecting over a WAN or even LAN across continents, you want to be reducing the amount of packets that you send across the network. And it's not just about the number of records, it's also about how efficient you are. So we wanted to really keep that down. So change views actually brings only the change information from the server back to your application. That's one key benefit from a performance aspect that a lot of client applications use, or benefit from, I would say.
Yeah, and even then, looking at it from specifically just the developer standpoint as well, I tend to find that every developer that I speak to that's starting to implement change views, they really are surprised at just how easy it is to actually go from, learning about what a change view is to actually implementing it, whether that be, within applications that they've been distributing out for years or even just sort of newer applications. And yeah, I think the way that we've designed it to be where it's so user-friendly and so easy to take advantage of has really helped a lot of developers as well with being able to understand how to use the technology.
One thing that I would add to that, Mary, is if you're a developer and you've implemented solutions in the past or thinking of implementing solutions where you're caching all of the data, then you're having some kind of business logic to figure out whether that is using timestamp about when the data is changed, and then taking only the delta records out and then presenting it to the applications. You can now offload all of that caching related logic. You can put it in the database and you can just pull just the information that you need or that you know has changed, and InterBase can provide you the change information. You don't have to cache all of that and do a delta diff or to get the delta records. So
yeah, that's one of the nice things that makes it very easy to retrofit onto systems. And I think, going back to what I was saying earlier, about it being very rad, when you're developing products and you're prototyping and you're working your way through things and you're getting that user input and feedback, having something like a change view rather than physical metadata that you're having to manage and work with within the database makes it a lot easier to worry about the user experience and the UI and getting those things right first, and then worrying about how you move the data around afterwards. You just know it's something you need to do and you can do later on. So I think we've got some really nice stuff within the components for doing that within FireDAC as well. Which,
yeah, the angle I wanted to underline is, well, actually two angles. One is it's really very easy to use, and if you compare it with what you would have to do to instrument the database and instrument your application to achieve something similar, and not really identical, but something similar, would require a lot of code, a lot of maintenance, a lot of continuous updates when you're changing some of the application logic or the server logic. And so it's really extremely easy to use, but even more if you consider the amount of code you can throw away or not write in the first place to achieve a similar functionality. I mean, consider using triggers to track change in the database, and then collecting data, and then building up something that is similar to a diff, but it's probably bigger anyway, because you don't do it at the field level, you do it at a record level. So it's really astonishing. But the other thing that's important is that this is the way you need. I mean, this is the approach you need when you move into a traditional client server architecture, where the client might be smart, but generally has a fairly good connectivity to the server. And even if you might need a little bit of caching, that's not really a big point. But when you're thinking about a multi-tier or heavily distributed architecture, where your client is a phone or a remote user or someone that has a relatively limited bandwidth compared to the amount of data that needs to be available at the client side, now the idea of change views really makes a big difference in those scenarios. I mean, if you think about a mobile app, I mean, you don't want to refetch, I mean, each lookup table or other artifacts continuously. On the other hand, the ability to have a lot of data on the client really makes it possible to get a much nicer and smoother user interface. Because of course you can say, hey, that data just sits on the server. I mean, I query only the limited things I need, but then it becomes very difficult to build a nice, smooth UI. I mean, for building a powerful UI, you need to have information. You need to be able to complete what the user is typing, specifically if it's typing on a device that's not really a keyboard, but it's awkward to use. So completion, look ahead, having information about what you're expecting the user to do, what he might be doing, typing, interacting with. I mean, all of that information is terribly useful on the client, because again, it provides a much nicer user experience and user interface. But at the same time, if you need to fetch all of that data over a potentially slow network, or not always fast network, I mean, that may be unreliable at times, then you're shooting yourself in the foot, because without the rich data, the application becomes terrible to use. So change views, because they allow you to reduce the bandwidth in a dramatic way and have always the right information available at the user end, they're really a great tool for modern days architectures.
Cool. I'm just kind of having a quick look at the time. I know we've got a number of questions that are kind of logging into the Q&A thing. So, Mary, do you want to just should we kind of part the change views part just for the moment? I know we got the next slide. I think it's got a number of useful links on it, and certainly what we can do is we'll put a blog post up after the session today, and make sure we follow up with the link to the replay and also the link to the bits that are in there. So have you got then can you move to the next slide?
Oh yes, there we go.
Yeah, so if you want to do a quick screen grab, then go ahead, otherwise we will get those links up to you later. The first one there is a change views white paper that we wrote XE7 times, so it's a few years old now, but it's highly relevant to the actual topic that we've just been talking about there. There's a whole load of additional stuff up on the doc wiki, embarcadero.com. You can just choose interface from there, and there's a whole section on change views to get straight into. I've got a series of blog posts under a tag on my blog, which take you through kind of the concepts and getting going with the initial bits. And Mary's done a really good dive-in video, which is about half an hour, getting in and running through it, with it completely in action, going through one of the samples. There's a pharmacy sample that's within the samples that ship with Rad Studio that's well worth having a look at, and that shows kind of a central database. And then you can run multiple versions of the client and actually see how the change views works with multiple different connections coming into it. And if you need to find anything further, then feel free to reach out to one of us or your local Embarcadero rep.
All right, moving on to encryption at rest, also for us known as granular or column level encryption. And it's actually a really cool feature that I personally recommend to anyone encrypting databases. Marco, Sriram, Stephen, comments?
Sure. Stephen, you may want to give a quick business review of how, or Marco, either one of you, and then I can just go into some of the details about the feature.
Sure. Okay. I think we've got a screenshot there. It's pretty easy to set up. You can do it through IB console. There's command line and MySQL that you can run as well. But basically, with the encryption, there's the ability to back up either the entire database or down to specific column levels. And I think we've got a slide a little bit afterwards, which we'll kind of go through some of the kind of the questions around the whys. But it's really important if you have any data that has any identifiable information within it. So in the UK, a postcode and a gender is enough to identify somebody. It could be the only female or only male who lives within that postcode of that gender. That's enough. So under GDPR rules and data compliance and all the other kind of things, it's really important to have your data encrypted at rest. And if you don't, I think under EU law at the moment, it's up to 10% of your global turnover you can be fined for a data breach, which is pretty serious. And we've seen case studies in the past where, I know there was one in the US where they actually had a data center. They had hard drives that were disconnected from computers in a filing cabinet, and they had a break-in, and somebody stole the drives from a cabinet, and they had to report it, and it cost them over $1.5 million because the data on those drives wasn't encrypted at rest. So it's a critical function for anybody running a business application. It's a critical feature for any OEM to be providing to their customers, because it's not only your reputation, it's your customer's reputation that you're putting at risk by not encrypting your data. And the one thing that's really nice, especially with the components within RAD Studios, it's so super easy to enable encryption on the database file, and to then enable it's like a single line to change. You literally just put in the de-encryption codes within the components, and off you go. But then having the ability to go even further than that, if you're looking at any kind of specific compliance, like PCI compliance or anything else like that, to have specific encryption keys where you can have multiple encryption keys, not only one for the database, but one for specific fields within the database. So for example, a credit card information, you might need to use a specific encryption key just for the credit card information to be PCI compliant. So that way, if somebody has access to one part of the database, they don't have access to another part. Now, you might be thinking, well, at a field level, doesn't that get a bit complicated? Well, one of the really nice things is the ability to have a default value when you set a field to be encrypted. So you can still run your SQL, but a HR manager will be able to run the same query as a normal user, and they might be able to see different parts of the data. So for example, the HR manager might be able to see the salary, whereas as a normal developer who's connecting up and working on the system isn't going to be able to see the salary information. So even within the QA, even within development of in-house systems, you can still restrict the development team from what they can see within the database while still allowing them to develop it and manage it and work with it correctly. So there's some really kind of useful abilities having those different levels linked into the user security as well.
If I can expand on that one, Stephen.
Please do.
From an encryption perspective, of course, we wanted to address end-to-end encryption. Of course, InterBase provides over-the-wire encryption from your client going to client-server communication through. We use OpenSSL underneath, very well used in the field out there, and we use a full SSL socket to have your data transmitted over the network. So at a minimum, I would say, if you are looking at strengthening your network vulnerabilities, definitely use over-the-wire encryption to start with. And then within a single system, you want to be encrypting the data that is at rest, which is the point of this particular slide. And within the data to be encrypted at rest, you can encrypt the whole database. If you want to keep it really simple, you can just encrypt the whole database with a single key and choose the key to be a strong key. InterBase supports both weak and strong key encryption, and the strong key can be mentioned in different strengths. 120 AES encryption is what we use, and 128 to 192 to 256. And you can choose the strength of the key, and that is not going to really impact the performance. It is just going to introduce more encryption or other stronger encryption for your data, and that might be a very minuscule performance impact in terms of encrypting and decrypting the data. But in the large scheme of things, performance impact is not big at all. So I would go with the 256-bit encryption as an AES key for your data that's at rest. The reason we introduced column level database encryption or a full file encryption is something that is not too difficult. You can just do it off the block for the whole file, and a lot of databases do support that. But the use cases of providing selective encryption for different entities within your database, like Steven said, there might be a lot more specific columns. Like in the US, you have social security information that might require a strong level of encryption, but within the same database, you might have salary information of employees, which might require a different level of encryption. Or even within different levels, you might have different people or different users of the database having access to specific pieces of information, and the encryptions for each one of those are driven by what we grant them. HR employee may not be able to see what finance employee from a finance department may be able to see, right? So we wanted to provide a full encryption management suite, but also use something that is intuitive that SQL developers are used to using, and that is a grant revoke SQL role level security. So you can provide encrypting and decrypting capabilities within the database through the grant revoke mechanism by having multiple encryption keys if you want to use or encrypt different assets inside your database differently, right? That is where column level encryption really comes into play. And if you have chosen to make not the whole database encrypted, but only one column in one table encrypted, that is all that that's the only performance impact. The rest of the data is that so database remains unencrypted, but only that column can be encrypted. And that is really useful when you're loading data and you don't have to go through the decryption for the rest of the tables or database pages that are not really encrypted. So you can have a very selective and customized deployment of your encryption mechanisms. And from a developer perspective, what's really cool in this, you can take any database, any InterBase database out there, and implement an encryption algorithm or encryption strategy at the deployment site, at the production site. You can have different encryption management rules for the same application, or different strengths of the keys for the same application, and you can just run through your whole grant revoke mechanisms and what procedures or tables have access to these encryption keys. So you can do all of that at the encryption side without putting that burden on the developer to decide initially what fields need to be encrypted.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things, or the important things to know here, is the SysDSO login, which is the system
Data security officer. Yeah.
Data security officer. Thanks. Yeah, that is the special user that then enables the granting and revoking of the rights. So you can't have a developer just go ahead and grant rights so he can go read the bits that he wants to read, you know, or anybody, you know, hacking it. You've got the two levels of security, which is kind of really cool.
The good separation of roles. Within
yeah, really good practice.
Yeah.
So I think we've kind of gone through a number of the questions on the left-hand side here. We've mentioned what kind of the row level encryption, the column level encryption is. Spoke about a couple of the different use cases around it. I think certainly we see there's a lot of standards now that it's really important to be able to have data encryption at rest, and the kind of the level of encryption that you get at rest is the same level that you achieve in the kind of the highest versions of, you know, SQL Server and the likes. And there's a really interesting cost comparison on the InterBase pages, looking at a server with unlimited users and the cost between, I think InterBase, which is just over $7,000 normally on list, compared to about $57,000. With InterBase, you get a license for a hot backup as well, which is really kind of quite powerful. And one of the things that's quite interesting is also the way the backup is set up. So when you go to back up an encrypted database, you create a backup key, which allows you to make a backup of the database without actually having to have the read access to the database, if that makes sense. So the backup encryption key is literally just for backing up the database. So by having that, it means you can actually put it into kind of batch files or anything else like that you're running to automate any of your backup and restore processes or anything else like that, without providing the golden key to your data. So from that, it's again a really nice separation and quite
and your backup file is encrypted as well completely.
Yeah, completely encrypted backup as well.
Yeah. And it makes it a lot nicer too, especially if you're going to be storing your backup files off-site, for instance, or at another location. With cloud being the way that it is, a lot of companies have moved towards having their backups be stored off-prem, and in this case in the cloud or in a data center. So having and making sure that that data is always secure, no matter where it is a really great thing to be able to say that we can do for our customers.
And encryption is also sort of extended for the data that you don't really see in the database or in your backup files. There is transient information that gets sorted and sort files are written out. All of those are encrypted as well. So there is no point in time where even transient data is left unencrypted on the system. If it's an encrypted database, that's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is there anything more from anybody on the encryption side?
If I may address just one question, and that's on the question slide, that's related to encryption. Somebody had a question about, can you enforce an encryption on a domain and not just a column? No, we cannot. A domain is more of a field type definition, whereas a column is an asset. So you can enforce or define encryptions on actual assets of data, whether that's a whole database or whether that's individual columns. So you'll have to enforce an encryption on the column, not on the domain.
Okay. Should we move on to our next section? So we've got some time still for the Q&A.
Yes, let's go ahead and move into the future with InterBase.
I'm going to get started here, but feel free to chime in with comments and ideas. So the first thing let's speak about the near future first. There are a few things in the works right now for InterBase. We have an update that is coming, and that is going to have primarily quality improvements, and it's going to address issues that have been raised by customers. But it also has a handful of new features and some additions to the current product that I'm sure would be nice. Now, the other thing that we've been working on that we feel is very important is we have started to make sure that InterBase can be a better option or a better solution for people outside of the RADStudio realm, which is what InterBase has been focused on quite a bit. So that's why we are focusing on having new ADO.NET drivers, and really may have a nice integration with Visual Studio, and trying to make sure that it becomes a really nice and viable alternative to other databases that are more commonly used on that platform, and be able to provide the great features that the product has for developers that, for whatever reason, and there are many, of course, don't use Delphi or C++ Builder. That's not the only direction in terms of integration with other languages and platforms. There are other angles that we're going to keep exploring in the future. But this one, because it traditionally was an area where we offered integration with Odbc drivers and some, although limited at today's time frame, some ADO drivers. We felt this was very important for the product to be able to be usable. The other thing that is equally important is that a lot of the customers that use InterBase and a lot of the RStudio developers also use Visual Studio in some of their projects. So the ability to have a single database that is used by projects with different languages, architectures, and tools is certainly key to a lot of our customers. So these are things that are being built, and even if anything I'm saying in terms of features and releases is subject to change and it's not committed, it's not certain, and so don't build your business decision on it. These are things that we are in active development and are expected to become available in the next quarter. Now we are also planning and working on different in other different angles, doing research work or doing preliminary work or actual development. There are many things that are in the plans for the product. A few that we want to mention are listed here. The first is around the overall user experience. InterBase is a product for developers, so we've often said, okay, yeah, doesn't look nice, meaning visually appealing, or because hey, it's not a tool for the end user, it's a tool for developers. So we've kind of neglected to clean up. And again, not primarily the user interface, that is important, but to some extent, but really the overall experience of the user. I mean, where errors are logged, how you get information, how you interact with the product, the various tools, and make sure that they work smoothly and they look like they're built for Windows 10 and not built for Windows XP, as it might seem at times. So really try to rethink the overall experience, the installation, the process, the model overall, and provide improvements. This will not be like one shot. I mean, one release. The idea is to identify a plan that's going to take probably more than 1 year to get deliveries in the hands of customers. And one of the reasons I wanted to mention it is that we are very open to feedback in this area, and I think we have some like asking if we're going to improve IP console, which is one of the open issues in this space. But again, if you have other ideas or recommendations in terms of improving the experience, I mean, if you have, young developers who've never seen InterBase in your teams and have been puzzled by some of the behavior or some of the, again, the way you interact with the tool, that is something that we are very interested in. So feel free to email or follow up with any of us, and we'll try to collect multiple viewpoints into this modernization and improvement effort. The other two things there are more technical, but they're equally important. Making sure we are up to date on security and security library versions, and making sure we always improve on the database performance. Our critical points are always on the table, but we might give an extra focus on. And the last thing, which is just, well, partially tied with RStudio, which is providing, at least in terms of an embedded database, support for the new macOS ARM CPU, the Apple Silicon ARM CPU, which is supposedly very fast. So it would be nice to have it running on a fast CPU and see what happens. So these are some of the things on the table. I mean, there are others that are equally important, and again, always interested in feedback about what you think should be added to the product.
Thanks, Marco. Marco, I'll just add on a couple of points about IB console. I know there were a few questions. I know we'll have a Q&A session separately, but since you mentioned about UI improvements, in InterBase 2020 release, we gave some time and effort to improving the stability of IB console and take out, I would say, some of the unintended behavior while you're working with queries within IB console, or just a traversal of the workflow of how you're defining an encrypted database, or working with subscribed information. All those areas have been somewhat tightened up, and some of it requires underneath changes in terms of IBX, because IB console uses IBX, which is a component framework for RAS Studio customers as well. So it strengthens it in both those layers, not only on the UI side, but also for customers who are building RAS Studio applications with IBX. You can now benefit from some of those enhancements. On the usability aspect for IB console, of course, it has better integration for server-side performance monitoring now. You're all probably familiar with the database-specific performance monitoring that InterBase uniquely provides in terms of through SQL queries. You can look at all of the performance statistics for who's connected, who's transacting, and what kind of queries are running, how long they've been running, how to shut them down if they have gone rogue. All this kind of information is now available on a system-wide. For a single InterBase instance, you can see across all the databases that particular instance services right now. And that area has been sort of improved in IB console performance monitoring UI. So we are trying to make it more useful, not only for the developer, but also for if there is an administrator that needs to take a look at it occasionally. And also while you're using the WI SQL component within IB console, you can selectively, I know a lot more better UI tools exist out there in terms of what queries you can select and execute for that particular instance, even though you have a full script of SQL statements. And IB console has a similar feature where you can select a single query within that list and make that available as a single point of execution. In addition to that, I think many of you are aware, within our IDERA family of tools, Aquadata Studio is a tool that is used by many database users around the world, not just for SQL Server or Oracle. It supports, I think the current count is something like about 40 different database vendors through that tool. And it supports InterBase as well, InterBase 2017 and InterBase 2020. So if you are a database data analyzer, or who is someone more attuned to working with visual productivity subsystems within any UI tool, definitely give a look into Aquadata Studio. One of the key features that it has compared to IB console is it is cross-platform. So if you're a developer working on Mac or Linux, you can still install and use Aquadata Studio with your InterBase servers and have a very good first-class UI tool in your product portfolio.
And if you're interested more in learning about InterBase, you can also check out the Embarcadero /product/InterBase homepage as well. And at the time of this webinar, through the rest of the month, we're also offering a 40% discount on all InterBase purchases. So if you are interested in purchasing InterBase, please reach out to your local Embarcadero sales manager, and you'll be able to take advantage of this excellent discount.
Yeah, and the other thing to remember is if you're using RAD Studio and you have the Enterprise or Architect Edition, then you have a runtime royalty-free distribution license for iOS and Android for InterBase to go. So you can deeply embed that inside your applications. You know, I have apps up on the App Store using InterBase to go with my data fully encrypted. Very, very nicely, working beautifully, being used by basketball referees all around the world. And it's, yeah, brilliant. It really just embed, deploy it, and relax, as they say.
Now we'll go ahead and move into our Q&A session. I know we've had a lot of questions, and I think we've been able to work through answering some of them, but we can kind of go back through and see if we can make sure we provide responses. One of the first questions that was asked is, are there any plans to restore backward compatibility with Gbac backups? They say this was removed in IB 2020 and the latest IB 2017 update. Comments?
I can take that one. That is never the intention, of course. I mean, InterBase believes in backward compatibility, and we have sort of delivered on that for all the time that I've been here. InterBase 2020 as a version supports all the way back to ODS 13 in terms of OLTP applications. But if you have a much older ODS 11 or 12, if you're coming from InterBase 7.5 from 17 years, 18 years ago, or if you're coming from InterBase 2007 from 14 years ago, those databases can still be backed up with InterBase 2020, right? And then you can restore it to the latest format and work with it. But we go back at least 4 major versions of the product in terms of being able to use the same database for your transactional work. In the InterBase 2020 release, there is a bug, of course, that you're not able to restore the database to an older ODS. You can restore it to a newer ODS, but if you're not able to restore it to an older ODS so that database can be deployed to an InterBase 2017 installation that you have somewhere else, that's a bug that we had to resolve, and that's a bug that's resolved in the upcoming update. So it's never been an intention to break compatibility to restore to older ODS versions. That was just a bug that will be fixed in the next update.
I was muted there. Thank you, Sriram. One of the next questions is, when do we plan to provide other solutions on managing InterBase beyond IB console? And I think the response that we had was actually that we have Aqua Data Studio, as Sriram mentioned. I will say it really is a phenomenal product to use as a developer. I personally use it and also demonstrate or perform demos with it as well to our architects prospects, and I will say it is one of my favorite tools outside of using IB console for very specific InterBase related things. And
there is one thing I would add on, Mary. IB console, even though it's a tool that we provide out of the box, and it by far has most of the InterBase features, whether you're a database user or if you're an administrator or a developer. IB console has a accumulation of all of those feature sets that are leveraged from the InterBase core engine, and also has support for the latest features, things like change views and encryption. IB console tool does have all of that leverage and showcase in that tool. I want to also add that there's a wide gamut of third-party tools out there, and it's not just Aqua Data Studio and IB console in the InterBase world. There are a lot of third-party tools out there. Many of you are familiar with IB Expert and Database Workbench, and there are many tools out there. I don't want to, SQL Lily is another. There are many tools. I don't want to just mention a couple and think that that's the only. So every tool has their own characteristics and benefits. So, and they're all quite cost effective. I don't really see any of them charging thousands of dollars for using the tool. There are many that are cost effective. So I would definitely encourage you to take a look at some of the third-party tools and see what benefits you and what is the kind of workflow that you are more accommodative of. I mean, what really does the work that you want it to do. And many of them are, most current on Windows platforms. There are not that many cross-platform tools. I mentioned Aqua Data Studio only because it's a cross-platform tool that's also provided by one of our sister companies in IDERA. But there are lots of other tools that are very popular in our customer ecosystem. And IB console is just out of the box. So you can definitely look at the third-party community.
Yeah, I think some of the updates to IB console in the recent versions as well, with the performance monitoring updates and everything else like that, there's some really powerful stuff that you can actually dive into on IB Console. I think a lot of people kind of miss a good chunk of the kind of the key stuff that is in there, beyond just being able to put together a database table and schema. And obviously, ER kind of tools like Aqua Data Studio gives a much easier way to kind of do that kind of things.
Another question that we had was, are there any plans to improve the performance of derived queries?
I've not seen any particular case reports from customers showcasing derived table query performance issues. So I'm not aware of what the question is intending to get addressed. But yeah, if there are issues that you see with our existing implementation of derived tables or common table expressions, please do let us know, and we can take a look at it.
Another question: in SQL Anywhere, I can set a user variable, which I used as the user that makes the changes. And I think the question.
Yeah, the question is about if you need users for change views. I would imagine, and how they apply to user accounts.
You only need to have a single user. Yeah, you only need to have a single user. The user is kind of like one part of the key. So the subscription, when you start subscription, there's two parts that you pass in. One's the user and one's the device ID.
That device ID is optional, yeah.
Yeah. So if you have kind of user foo and device 1, user foo device 2, user foo device 3. So you can have your phone, your laptop, your desktop. Each subscription will be keeping its own kind of fingerprint in essence. So you can do that on using kind of the device IDs, or you can do it using the user plus a device ID. So you could have Shriram and a device ID of laptop, and you could have Stephen and a device ID of laptop. But if you're managing a unique reference for each one of the subscriptions, then you could just use a GUID and pass that as the device ID. InterBase really doesn't care what it is that you pass in. It's just using the two parts of the information together to be able to give you a unique fingerprint for running a subscription change view.
Yeah, and there are different use cases, of course. If you're like any end consumer, you use the same application on your mobile and you're using it on your desktop or your laptop, and you want that continuity in terms of, say you work during your work day, you're working on your laptop or desktop and you're looking at current information using your application, and during the later parts of the evening or when you're off work or when you're using your mobile device like your phone or smartphone to use the same application to look at the data, you may not want to use device specific change tracking. You might want only something that is attached to a user, right? So as a single user, you're getting a single viewpoint. So when you transition from your desktop laptop to your mobile, you don't end up seeing all of the changes once again. You just change what is relevant to you. So you implement your subscription based on just the username and not add the device at that in that particular use case. But if there are use cases where you want to go through the whole experience of what's changed on that particular device, then you want to also attach the device ID as part of your subscription identity.
You just actually reminded me of one other interesting bit of topic information, really. If you were fetching, say, information from a stock table, you could do select star from stock, and it would just give you all the changes to the stock table that have happened since you last fetched the data. But what you can do is you could run a query first, select count from stock, and find out what records have actually changed along these kind of lines. And actually, once you know, you could say, well, actually, I've got 5 records that have changed here. Okay, great, I'll pull those down. If it's 500,000, you might go, I'm on a mobile connection right now. You can flag that to the user, and then you can roll back the transaction. And then you can, the user can then turn onto the Wi-Fi and can then pull the data down over the Wi-Fi rather than over the cellular data connection. So you can actually be really smart about picking up when you pull the changes down through the queries that you run within it. And because we've got that ability to commit or roll back, it's quite quite powerful in that regards.
Yeah, and even within, to expand on that one, even within the query, we have added adjuncts or add-on conditions that you can, filters that you can impose. Things like, even though you might have subscribed to inserts, updates, and deletes on a particular table, but there might be instances in your application where you may just want to say, I just want to look at deleted information, right? I'm not interested in getting all the records on the table that have been newly inserted or updated, right? So in that case, you can just write your SQL and add on the clause to say where so-and-so column is updated or is deleted. So that all those additional conjuncts that you can put in will basically filter the result set in the engine itself and only give you the records that adhere to that particular semantic, to that rule.
There's a question here about InterBase in the cloud, and from David I. Hi, David.
Hi, David.
Oh, he says hello, Sharon, as well on the end of it. So yeah, is it possible to run InterBase up in the cloud, for example, on an Amazon EC2 instance?
As a database product that is bundled in your application, yes, definitely. I mean, you can run it. I mean, it's just another VM that you can run InterBase on, but we don't have any first level or tight integrations with the cloud ecosystem. So you cannot benefit. For example, Amazon provides ODS capabilities, right? Remote relational database service for many of the popular databases out there. There is no relational database service for InterBase. But if you're deploying your application embedded with InterBase, you can run it as easily in the cloud as you can on your local ecosystem within your enterprise.
Yeah, and there's a further question.
You have to, of course, yeah, just as you would go through any client server setup in the cloud, you have to open up the ports where InterBase is receiving, especially if you're allowing clients from outside the cloud to connect to your database server directly. You want to enforce that security policy in your cloud instance where you open up the ports where InterBase is listening.
Yeah, there was a follow-up question about if you could use IB Lite to run there. Again, you could run it on there, but it would be a single connection, single transaction only, because that's what IB Lite is limited to. So it would have very, very limited use cases in terms of a cloud deployment for.
Yeah, but you can do it. You may have an application server that probably just wants to store some local data within that instance. You can use IB Lite or IB2Go for that purpose. And if you want to, of course, go beyond the limited restrictions that IB Lite has, you can use IB2Go as an embedded database for that specific application for that single data store. Or if you want to provide multi-user capability or multiple threads to be running against the database, you can have an InterBase server running on the same instance.
Yeah, there's also a question here about replication. Are there replication products that you can use with InterBase, or in the case of using the ChangeViews API? Also, it depends on your use case. There are replication tools that are provided by third parties out in the ecosystem for running InterBase. They're predominantly trigger based, which obviously, when you get down to synchronizing data between multiple data points, can become quite clumsome to manage and work, which is the whole reason for having ChangeViews. So have a look at the pharmacy demo. It really is quite straightforward and simple to use the APIs with the components that are there. Literally just start the transaction, run the SQL, and you can then use FireDAC to just merge the changes in locally into your local database. So it really is very, very straightforward, and a lot more lightweight than having to have and manage a full replication system and configuration. To kind of give you an idea, one of the challenges around trigger replication, if you had site A and site B and you wanted to keep them in sync, which quite often happens when you have, say, two businesses that you can, if you belong to one, you can go to the other. What happens is you get a change at site A, that then gets logged to then come to site B, and you then get a change at site B. Well, that's a change that's then happened. So you need to make sure that the logic on the triggers in site B knows that that change has come from site A, because otherwise what's going to happen, it's going to go, oh, there's a change here, and it's going to end up with a circular change constantly replicating. So, which is an absolute nightmare. So you need to have logic within the triggers to know that, all right, I'm connecting from site A to site B, so you need to log in as a separate user to then be able to make the changes, to then make sure that those changes don't get logged to then go back to the original source. You know, change views takes care of all of that for you. It knows and understands all those kind of concepts. So really, really is lightweight. Now that gets even more complicated when you've got 3 sites that are then trying to replicate around and move data between each other. And you almost need to choose which one's going to be the middle, and then make sure that, you know, if the changes are coming from this site or that site, you don't update them to then move to this site or to that site. So it becomes a right nightmare having multiple sites that you're moving data between in traditional replication approaches. So hence the change views approach by far is the best way to go if you're trying to build stuff to replicate around in that way. You know, the one thing that you lose out by not having log files is having the sequential order of what's changed. We can tell you which records have changed and which fields have changed, but we don't log the old value and the new value. That's really down to the developer to say, right, I've got the current value here because that's really what I care about, and applying that in. So if you need to get those sequential changes, then you need to look at some, you know, traditional log-based replication. But 95% of the use cases, 99% of the use cases that I've ever seen, all you care about is what the current value is. And if the trigger is supposed to be doing something because of the old value to the new value, that should be logged at the point of origin, and then that record moved, rather than trying to recreate that change and delta change as the data is being moved. Now, the other thing that you can look at if you just need to push a copy of the database is there's things like data dumps that you can do, which are an exceptionally fast way to push a dump of the data out. And if you're using change views, that's the recommended way to back up the database. The other thing you can look at is the incremental data dumps and data backups. And the other thing is the bit that gives the point-in-time recovery. The name's off the top of my head. I've just lost it, Shram.
Journaling, this long-term journaling.
Journaling, there we are, yeah. So journaling is an exceptionally great way to make InterBase scream in speed-wise, and also to be able to provide kind of full point-in-time recovery. And then you can use those journals to back up and to restore onto a hot backup and so on as well. So if you did something stupid like, you know, delete from customer where ID equals 1, you know, that, you know, or, you literally, you're going to delete a record, you can then go and roll it back from the point in time recovery. And obviously if you've got change views tracking the changes that have happened from deletes, you'll be able to find that record as well. So it actually gives some quite powerful auditing capabilities as well in certain use cases. So, but we haven't kind of covered journaling in this webinar. And journaling is certainly one thing from the speed benchmarks that we did a number of years ago. Enabling journaling, once you get to around about a 4-site scenario in some of the test configurations, enabling journaling, the speed just keeps going like that. Whereas if you add multiple, more and more data into it without the journaling, you see the degradation. So journaling, especially if you've got large databases, an absolute must. It really makes a big difference to speed. Arson's put a message in here about it's just some logging bugs through about InterBase. I say if there's specific things that you want to follow up with, feel free to email me, stephen.ball@embarcadero.com. I can kind of have a look into some of those for you with the team or anybody on the webinar. But again, yeah, just the quality portal. If there's anything that you see, just like Brad Studio, if there's any use cases, then please provide us a sample of how to recreate it. And that can then be looked into. But the one thing I certainly will say, picking up on one of the other questions from within the log, in terms of the kind of the testing and so on, InterBase has a huge test suite that runs within the build process and before every release. I remember when we were working on a few bits about 4 or 5 years ago, we ended up having to do work to split the test cases out into batches to enable them run, because especially testing on things like iOS and Android, the sheer volume of tests that we need to run on small powered devices meant that it was just taking too long to run the test cases because there were that many to run through. So we actually divvied them up and broke them down and have them running on multiple devices in parallel. It is the best tested product that we have. It is test by design, is built into what we do. With the one thing over the years, as scenarios have been risen from customer use cases, they've then actually formed into part of the testing process, because we know there's the kind of things that we want to check for regression tests against. So it's really strong in that kind of area as well, with benchmarking, testing against the speed of things as well. So it is really detailed and dedicated testing that runs through, and it has to be, because this is trusted by people who are putting people's lives in the hands of the data that's being stored in the database engine. We take very seriously the kind of the customer base that we have, especially around medical, and that is why it is so well and heavily tested in the way that it is. Guys, any other questions that you're picking up there that you want to kind of pick up on that's not been answered already?
There was a question about what are the advantages of using a 64-bit version, and should we think about changing to it? I would definitely recommend that you do on a couple of levels, right? Most of the operating system vendors are transitioning away from 32-bit and encouraging their customers to move on to 64-bit. Not only does it provide a lot more scalability from a system perspective, but from an interface perspective, you have very clear advantages in terms of keeping a lot more data in memory. For example, in your database cache, you want to be able to use the addressable space beyond 4 gigabytes. And databases nowadays, the way they grow, you definitely have a lot more data than can fit in memory. So the more you can cache in memory from your database is definitely useful from that aspect. The one aspect that you will probably trip across if you're using any third-party UDF libraries that either don't have sources on, and we have come across a couple of those. Our customers have come across those as well, or there are third-party libraries that are only available in a 32-bit format. Those have to be transitioned to 64-bit, and that's the only change that you will see from a requirement perspective. You'll have to get the UDF libraries that are compatible on that 64-bit architecture. Beyond that, InterBase as a plug and play replacement from 32-bit to 64-bit is just a simple install of the 64-bit instance, and that is all that you need. And then, of course, you can take a look at the IB-config customizations and the database properties that you can set to leverage or make better use of your system resources in terms of large database cache and things like that. Or even, I would definitely encourage you to move to 64-bit if you have your third-party dependencies ironed out.
Yeah, I'm just putting into the chat. There's a recent case study we did with Odbc, who are a big financial transaction company, and at their peak, they're transacting over 500,000 transactions, financial transactions a day through InterBase, which is phenomenal. They've got over 5 million transactions each month that are heading through the database, and really happy with InterBase. It really works well for them.
As Marco mentioned, I'll just probably reiterate that fact. And when you're looking at InterBase as a jumpstart environment for people who are not familiar with the product, if you're looking at initial roadblocks in terms of the intuitiveness of using the product or ease of features from within the tool or within the engine in terms of DDL semantics and such, please do send us feedback so we can make the product more easy to grasp for newcomers.
Yeah, that's important. We're always more than willing to to be reached. So you have our contact information. It's quite straightforward. It's our first and last name at embarcadero.com. Yeah, always very happy to engage and have a conversation. And I think this has been a very nice conversation. Sorry we haven't gone through all of the questions, but I think we went through the most common ones or relevant ones. Also, for a bunch of them, we just provided like some written written feedback in the chat itself. Because I think we are kind of a bit over time, and
yes, I was going to
as
say,
much as we appreciate you sticking around, I mean, we don't want to use too much of your time.
May I just use the opportunity to address one more question on the encryption angle?
Sure, go ahead.
I see there's a question about what's the performance impact of using the different encryption strengths. In our testing, we have gone from weak encryption to the strongest of encryption with 256 AES, and we have seen a performance impact of up to 5% in our testing for multi-user environments. In our internal testing, of course, our internal test use are not reflective of your application use and how many users you are simultaneously connecting, or how much data, whether you're doing full database. This is for a full database encryption. So all of the database pages are encrypted and decrypted at rest, right? They're encrypted. So when we go through full encryption of the whole database, we're seeing about a 5% impact on the decryption requirement in memory. But if you're selectively doing column level encryption, say there's only one or two or a few handful of columns within the database that you have encrypted, then the impact to the larger system, larger instance of InterBase is nothing other than when you're querying those tables that have those encrypted columns. So there is no impact across the database in other areas that are not encrypted.
Yeah, I think one of the important things is that once the encryption overhead is only at the point that the data is being read from the disk and into memory. It's decrypted obviously to work through with the SQL queries and everything else like that. So once it's pulled into the engine to work with in memory, there is no further impact or cost at that point.
That is true for full database encryption, but not for column level encryption, right? On column level encryption, every record that is stored is encrypted with that encrypted column data. So when we pull out the data, that is when we actually decrypt that information. So that impact is there for column level encryption. The one additional thing I would mention is in terms of, I think I lost my train of thought in terms of providing some information on column level encryption. What is that? Okay, if it comes to me, I'll post it later.
Okay, guys.
I did remember. When you do change, this is very rare for customers to do, but if you do change your encryption key on a particular column, while the database is in use, you say you decide this weak encryption is not, that 128-bit AES key is not a good key for, say, social security, and you want to put a 256-bit encryption key on that same column. So you do an alter of the encryption key on that column. And at that time, there is an additional performance impact where we have to go through the whole table, rip out all of the encrypted data with the old encryption key, and put in the encrypted data with the new encryption key. So we don't leave any vulnerable pieces of information. Or if you're going through a transition where a column is not encrypted and now you enforce an encryption key on top of it, we have to make sure that the data is encrypted and it is at rest, stays encrypted. So that's the time we actually have a background task that goes through all of the records and updates it. So the database is now encrypted fully for that particular asset. So that's a performance impact you would not have seen if you're not using encryption at all, where if you're just gone ahead and added a new column to a table, it's just a metadata definition. But if you are changing an encryption, going from a non-encrypted to an encrypted, we have to make sure that we encrypt the data at rest. So that's the time when we enforce this additional task in the background. Thank you.
Okay, guys. So, I think we need to kind of draw this to a close now. Thank you for the questions, for making this engaged. And without your questions coming through, it is kind of quite a boring thing to do. So yeah, the questions have been great. We've had some really good comments and stuff in through the chat. So thank you very much for those. I hope we've whetted your appetite to go and have a look at change views and also the encryption. It's definitely something that would highly recommend. Mary's done some excellent videos in the recent past, deep diving into those to show you exactly how to do it and what you need to do. So if you need to look for those, please go to the Embarcadero YouTube channel and just kind of search through for InterBase, and you'll see a number of those come up. Just as a reminder, we do have a really amazing promo running for the next 8 days with 40% off InterBase to go, InterBase desktop and server licenses. The InterBase to go, as I say, is included within the Enterprise and Architect edition already. If you're not on the latest version, then there's some great promotions running around on the Enterprise and Architect edition, and even Professional as well at the moment to help you move up. But if you're after InterBase, then I definitely recommend looking at the Enterprise or Architect. And obviously Architect includes the Aquadata Studio. So if you need any help with those, then please just visit the Embarcadero website and hit the contact sales, and one of the guys will be able to be in touch, and we're more than happy to kind of help discuss what you're trying to do, and if you have any further questions, if InterBase is the right fit for you. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Mary, for hosting today. Thank you, Sriram, as always, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Thanks a lot. Stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe. Bye.
Bye-bye.